Nolan lay in bed, his hand resting lightly on Allison's waist as they watched the flickering shadows of the bedside lamp dance across the ceiling. The night had been wonderful. 20 years of marriage celebrated with a candlelit dinner, quiet laughs, and nostalgic stories that seemed to reaffirm the bond they had built over 2 decades. Nolan had even held her hand on the drive home, a small but loving gesture he hadn't done in years. He felt content, almost sentimental, as he kissed her temple and whispered, "Happy anniversary, Allison. Here's to 20 more." Allison shifted slightly and mumbled, "Yeah, 20 more," before pulling away. She sat up abruptly, her movements breaking the fragile intimacy of the moment. Nolan glanced up at her, puzzled by the sudden change in her demeanor. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with concern. Allison hesitated, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her nightgown. She took a deep breath, avoiding his gaze. "Nolan, I have to confess something." Nolan's stomach tightened, though he tried not to let his anxiety show. "Okay," he said slowly, pushing himself up to lean against the headboard. "What is it?" She finally looked at him, her expression unreadable. "It's about us. About our marriage. About Charles." "Charles?" Nolan frowned. "What does my brother have to do with this?" Her lips curled into a faint, bitter smile as she straightened her back. "Everything, actually." The way she said it set off alarms in Nolan's mind. He felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to remain composed. "What are you talking about, Allison?" he pressed. "I've been sleeping with Charles," she said bluntly, her tone cold and matter-of-fact. "Since the day we got married." Nolan stared at her, his mind reeling. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. "And before you ask," Allison continued, her voice gaining a sharp edge, "it's not just some meaningless fling. I love him, Nolan. He's more of a man than you'll ever be. He understands me in ways you never could." The words hit Nolan like a punch to the gut, but he didn't flinch. Years of being the calm, level-headed one in their marriage had taught him how to mask his emotions, even when his world was crumbling. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Allison shook her head, her smirk widening. "No joke, Nolan. In fact, Charles and I have decided to stop hiding. We're tired of sneaking around. And, oh, by the way," she paused, her eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. "The kids? They're his, not yours." Nolan's jaw tightened, his hands balling into fists beneath the covers. "You're saying all 3 of our children, not Lauer," Allison interrupted, her tone mocking. "They're his. Every single one. And honestly, we thought you'd take the news better if we gave you a role in their lives. Uncle, perhaps? You've always been so good at being second best." She laughed then, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed in the silence of the room. Nolan felt his chest tighten as he fought the urge to lash out. He took a deep breath, his mind racing. For a moment, he considered yelling, throwing something, demanding answers, but then he stopped himself. Instead, he reached for his phone on the nightstand. Allison's laughter faltered. "What are you doing?" she asked, her tone tinged with uncertainty. Nolan didn't answer. He unlocked his phone, scrolled through his contacts, and tapped on a name. "Hey, Charles," he said, his voice calm and deliberate. "Mom's asking about the DNA test results I sent her last week." The color drained from Allison's face. Her smirk vanished, replaced by a look of pure panic. What are you talking about?" she stammered. Nolan lowered the phone, ending the call without waiting for a response. He set it down on the nightstand and turned to face her, his expression cold and unyielding. "You think I didn't know?" he said quietly, his voice steady but filled with an edge of steel. "You think I didn't notice the way you looked at him? The way he conveniently showed up every time you needed help with something? I've had my suspicions for years, Allison, and now I have proof." Allison's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She looked like a deer caught in headlights, her confidence crumbling under the weight of his revelation. "You lied to me," Nolan continued, his voice growing firmer with each word. "You betrayed me. You humiliated me. And you expect me to just sit here and accept it?" "Nolan, please," Allison finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "I didn't mean—" "Don't," he snapped, cutting her off. Don't you dare try to justify this. You made your choices. And now, you're going to face the consequences. Allison reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled away, his eyes blazing with anger. Nolan, I'm sorry, she pleaded. I didn't mean for it to go this far. It was a mistake. Mistake? Nolan laughed bitterly. A mistake is forgetting our anniversary. Sleeping with my brother for 20 years? That's not a mistake. That's a calculated betrayal. Tears welled up in Allison's eyes, but Nolan felt no sympathy. He stood up, grabbing his robe from the chair by the bed. You've destroyed this marriage, Allison. You've destroyed our family. But you're not going to destroy me. Nolan, wait, she cried, scrambling to her feet. We can fix this. We can go to therapy. We can. It's too late, he said firmly, cutting her off once again. You made your bed. Now you can lie in it. Alone, he walked out of the bedroom, leaving Allison standing there, her face pale and her body trembling. As he closed the door behind him, he felt a surge of clarity, his mind already beginning to formulate a plan. This wasn't just about anger or heartbreak. This was about justice, about holding Allison and Charles accountable for their betrayal. And Nolan was determined to make sure they paid for every lie, every deceit, and every moment of pain they had caused him. The night that had started with love and celebration had ended in devastation. But for Nolan, it was also the beginning of something new, something stronger, something unstoppable. Nolan sat at the head of the dining table, his hands clasped tightly in front of him. The air in the room was suffocating, tension palpable. Across from him sat Allison, her face pale and tear-streaked, and next to her, Charles, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Nolan had called this family meeting early that morning, and now, under the cold light of reality, the truth was about to unravel further. Charles cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Nolan, listen. I know how this looks, but... Nolan raised a hand, his expression stony. Don't. Just don't. Charles hesitated, glancing at Allison for support. She avoided his gaze, her hands trembling in her lap. Nolan's voice was calm but ice-cold as he leaned forward. I've been quiet for too long. I let things slide when I shouldn't have. I ignored the signs because I wanted to believe in family. But you, he pointed at Charles, his finger steady. You are no brother of mine. Nolan, let me explain. Charles stammered, his voice rising. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. It got out of control. Out of control? Nolan snapped, his voice sharp. It started on my wedding day, Charles. My wedding day? You didn't just cross a line. You destroyed the line, and then you kept coming back for more. Charles looked down at the table, his face flushed. Nolan turned to Allison, who flinched under his gaze. And you, 20 years. 20 years of lies, of betrayal, of smiling in my face while you carried on with him. Allison's voice was barely above a whisper. I didn't mean for it to go on this long. Stop lying, Nolan interrupted. You meant for it to go on? Every lie, every excuse, every time you looked me in the eye and told me you loved me. None of it was real, was it? It was real. Allison blurted, tears streaming down her face. It was Nolan. I loved you, I swear I did. But things with Charles, they were different. Different? Nolan let out a bitter laugh. Oh, I bet they were. Different enough to make a fool out of me. Different enough to steal 20 years of my life. Allison wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Nolan, please. We can work through this. For the kids. The kids? Nolan's voice hardened, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. Don't you dare bring them into this. But they're innocent in all of this. Allison cried. They don't deserve to lose their father. They already lost their father, Nolan said, his voice cutting through her pleas. Because I'm not their father. Charles is. Isn't that right? Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding Nolan's gaze. Allison looked down, her silence confirming what Nolan already knew. Nolan clenched his fists, his knuckles turning white. Do you even realize what you've done? You've taken everything from me. My family, my marriage, my children. And for what? For him. Charles finally spoke, his voice defensive. It's not like I wanted this to happen, Nolan. It just had happened. We didn't plan it. Nolan's eyes snapped to his brother. You didn't plan it? He repeated, his voice deadly calm. You're telling me that for 20 years, you accidentally slept with my wife? You accidentally fathered my kids? Spare me the excuses, Charles. I didn't mean to hurt you, Charles said weakly. But you did, Nolan said, his voice rising. You hurt me, you betrayed me, and you didn't care. You thought you could get away with it, didn't you? Charles opened his mouth to respond, but Nolan cut him off. You know what the worst part is? Nolan said, his voice trembling with anger. I trusted you. I defended you when people said you were reckless, selfish. I gave you chance after chance because you were my brother. And this is how you repay me? Nolan, I'm sorry, Charles said, his voice barely audible. Sorry. Nolan barked. You're sorry? That's supposed to make it better? That's supposed to undo 20 years of lies. Allison reached out to touch Nolan's hand, but he pulled away, his expression filled with disgust. Nolan, please, she said, her voice shaking. I know we've hurt you, but we can make this right. We can. Stop, Nolan said sharply. Just stop. There's no we anymore, Allison. You and Charles made sure of that. Allison sobbed quietly, her shoulders shaking as she buried her face in her hands. Nolan stood, pushing his chair back with a loud scrape. He looked down at the two people who had betrayed him, his expression cold and unyielding. You know what the worst part is? He said, his voice steady. I gave you everything. I gave you my love, my trust, my loyalty. And you threw it all away. You didn't just betray me. You destroyed me. Nolan, Allison began, but he cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand. You don't get to talk anymore, he said firmly. I'm done listening to your lies. He turned to Charles. And you've taken everything from me. My wife, my kids, my family. But I'll tell you this. You're not walking away from this unscathed. You're going to pay for what you've done. Both of you are. Charles paled, his eyes widening. What are you talking about? You'll find out soon enough, Nolan said darkly. Nolan, don't do anything rash, Allison pleaded. Rash? Nolan repeated, his voice filled with bitterness. You mean like betraying my husband with his brother? Like lying to my face for 20 years? Don't talk to me about rash, Allison. He turned and walked toward the door, his movements deliberate and controlled. He paused in the doorway, turning back to face them one last time. I hope it was worth it, he said quietly, because the two of you just lost everything. With that, he walked out, leaving Allison and Charles alone in the suffocating silence of their betrayal. Allison collapsed into tears, her sobs echoing in the empty room. Charles sat frozen, his mind racing as he tried to comprehend the magnitude of what had just happened. Neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say. And for the first time in 20 years, Nolan felt a strange sense of clarity. He had been betrayed, yes, but he was no longer the victim. He was in control now, and he was determined to make them pay for every lie, every betrayal, every moment of pain they had caused him. The fallout was only beginning. Nolan sat at his desk in the quiet of his home office, the dim light of a single desk lamp casting long shadows across the room. In front of him lay a neatly organized stack of papers, USB drives, and screenshots. For weeks, he had worked tirelessly, piecing together every shred of evidence he could find about Allison and Charles's affair. Emails, text messages, secret photos, every deceitful moment was now cataloged with precision. Nolan's meticulous nature, the very thing Allison once mocked as boring and obsessive, was now his greatest weapon. His lawyer, Millie, sat across from him, skimming through the documents with a practiced eye. She let out a low whistle and looked up at him. This is damning, Nolan, she said. If you're serious about taking this to court, they don't stand a chance. I'm serious, Nolan replied, his voice calm but resolute. I want them to pay for everything they've done, not just to me but to my life, my kids. This isn't just about the affair. It's about justice. Millie nodded, tapping the edge of the stack. You've got more than enough evidence to prove fraud. The DNA tests on the kids alone, this isn't just personal, it's criminal. Charles and Allison have lied to you for 2 decades. That has legal consequences. Nolan leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. Good? I want every one of those consequences to hit them hard. The day of the court hearing arrived quickly. The courtroom was packed, the buzz of whispers filling the air as people waited for the proceedings to begin. On one side of the room sat Nolan, dressed sharply in a dark suit, his face calm and impassive. Beside him was Millie, her demeanor professional and confident. On the other side sat Allison and Charles. Allison's face was pale, her hands trembling as she clutched a tissue. Charles looked disheveled, his usual air of arrogance replaced with visible unease. The judge entered, and the courtroom fell silent. "This court is now in session," the bailiff announced. As the proceedings began, Nolan felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, yes, but also a cold sense of satisfaction. For so long, he had been the one betrayed, the one left in the dark. Now, he was the one holding all the cards. Millie stood to address the court. "Your Honor, my client, Nolan Parker, has endured years of deceit and betrayal at the hands of his wife, Allison Parker, and his brother, Charles Parker. This case isn't just about infidelity. It's about fraud, conspiracy, and the theft of a man's life." She presented the DNA test results, which confirmed that all three of the children Nolan had raised were biologically Charles's. She showed emails and text messages between Allison and Charles, some going back nearly 2 decades, detailing their affair and mocking Nolan behind his back. The courtroom murmured as each piece of evidence was revealed. Charles's lawyer stood to respond, but his arguments were weak and unconvincing. "Your Honor, my client deeply regrets his actions, but we believe this is a private matter, not a legal one," the judge interrupted, her voice firm. "Fraudulent misrepresentation in a marriage is not just a private matter, counsel. Mr. Parker was deliberately deceived for 20 years, leading to financial and emotional damages. The evidence speaks for itself." When Allison took the stand, she broke down in tears almost immediately. "Nolan," she sobbed, addressing him directly, "I know I've hurt you. I know what I did was unforgivable, but please, I never wanted it to come to this. I never wanted to destroy us." Nolan stared at her, his face emotionless. "You didn't just destroy us, Allison. You destroyed me. And you did it for 20 years without a second thought. Save your tears for someone who cares." Allison sobbed harder, burying her face in her hands. Charles was next to testify. He avoided Nolan's gaze, his voice shaky as he spoke. "Look, I made mistakes. I let things go too far, but I never meant to hurt my brother. He trailed off, unable to finish. Nolan's voice cut through the silence. "You didn't just hurt me, Charles. You took my entire life and made it your playground. And now, you want to stand here and pretend it wasn't intentional? You're pathetic." The judge called for order as murmurs rippled through the courtroom. When the verdict was finally delivered, the room fell silent. "Allison Parker and Charles Parker," the judge said, her tone stern, "this court finds you guilty of fraud and conspiracy. Your actions have caused irreparable harm, and such betrayal cannot go unpunished. I hereby sentence you both to 3 years in prison and order financial restitution to Mr. Nolan Parker for damages incurred." The gavel struck, sealing their fate. As Allison and Charles were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, Nolan stood watching, his expression unreadable. Allison turned to him, her eyes red and swollen. "Nolan, please. I'm sorry. I'll do anything. Just please don't let it end like this." Nolan's gaze was cold, his voice steady. "It ended the day you betrayed me, Allison. You made your choices. Now live with them." Charles tried to speak, but Nolan didn't even glance in his direction. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed, eager for a statement. Nolan raised a hand to silence them. "I have nothing to say about them," he said, his voice firm. "But I will say this: betrayal has consequences. And no matter how long it takes, the truth always comes out." He walked away without another word, leaving the chaos behind him. Later that evening, Nolan sat alone on the porch of his home, the quietness of the night a stark contrast to the events of the day. He stared out at the horizon, a strange sense of peace settling over him. For the first time in years, he felt free. Free from lies, from betrayal, from the weight of a marriage that had been a facade for far too long. As the stars began to appear in the night sky, Nolan allowed himself a small smile. He had lost so much, but he had also gained something invaluable: clarity. And this time, he was determined to rebuild his life on a foundation of truth and strength, no matter how long it took. Nolan woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside his bedroom window. The familiar weight that had once rested heavily on his chest each morning was gone. The house felt quieter now, but it wasn't an empty kind of quiet. It was peaceful. For the first time in years, Nolan felt like he was breathing freely. The past few months had been transformative. Allison and Charles were gone, serving their sentences, and Nolan was finally free to rebuild his life on his terms. There were no more lies, no more betrayal lurking in the shadows. Just him, a fresh start, and the chance to rediscover who he was. At work, Nolan threw himself into his projects with a newfound sense of purpose. His colleagues noticed the change almost immediately. "Hey, Nolan," his coworker Greg said as they wrapped up a meeting. "I don't know what's changed, but you've been killing it lately. You're like a new man." Nolan chuckled. "Thanks, Greg. Let's just say I've had some clarity recently." "Well, whatever it is, keep it up. It's good to see you like this," Greg said, clapping him on the back before heading out. Nolan lingered in the conference room for a moment, staring out the window. He had spent so many years focusing on keeping his family together, on being the provider, the dependable one. Now, he realized how much of himself he had given away without even noticing. "It's time to live for myself," he muttered under his breath. One evening, as Nolan was cleaning out the garage, he came across an old box of woodworking tools. He had almost forgotten about them. Back in his 20s, before the responsibilities of marriage and fatherhood had consumed his time, he had loved woodworking. There was something meditative about shaping raw wood into something meaningful. He dusted off the tools and decided to start small. Over the next few weeks, his evenings were spent in the garage, sanding, carving, and assembling. By the time he finished his first project, a beautifully crafted coffee table, he felt a sense of accomplishment he hadn't experienced in years. It was during one of these evenings that Millie stopped by to drop off some legal paperwork. She had been instrumental in helping Nolan during the court case, and while their interactions had initially been purely professional, a quiet friendship had begun to form between them. "Wow," Millie said, stepping into the garage and eyeing the coffee table. "You made this?" Nolan smiled, wiping his hands on a rag. "Yeah, it's been a while since I've done anything like this, but it feels good to create something again." Millie ran her fingers along the smooth edge of the table, impressed. "It's beautiful. You've got a real talent." "Thanks," Nolan said, setting the rag aside. "What about you? Any hidden talents I don't know about?" Millie laughed, a warm, genuine sound that filled the room. "If you count burning toast as a talent, then sure." They both laughed, and for a moment, the weight of their shared hardships seemed lighter. Over time, their friendship deepened. Millie had her own scars, a messy divorce that had left her guarded but determined to move forward. Nolan admired her strength, her ability to see the good in people despite what she had been through. One evening, they met for coffee at a small cafe near Nolan's house. "You've been through so much, Nolan," Millie said, stirring her drink. "But here you are, finding your way back. It's inspiring." Nolan shook his head modestly. "I don't know about that. I'm just trying to figure things out one day at a time." She smiled. "That's all any of us can do. But you deserve happiness, Nolan. Real happiness. You've earned it." Nolan looked at her, feeling a warmth he hadn't felt in years. "So do you, Millie? Maybe we can find it together." Her eyes softened, and she reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "I'd like that." Despite the progress Nolan was making, there were still moments when the past crept in. One afternoon, he received a letter from Allison. It had been months since the sentencing, and he hadn't heard from her since. The sight of her handwriting on the envelope made his stomach tighten. He debated throwing it away, but ultimately decided to read it. "Nolan, I don't know if you'll even read this, but I need to try. I think about what I did to you every single day. I can't undo the pain I caused, and I'll never forgive myself for betraying you. I know you won't believe me, but I did love you. A part of me still does. I hate myself for what I did, and I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I want you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry. Take care of yourself, Nolan. You deserve better." Allison, Nolan folded the letter and set it aside. Her words stirred something in him, but not in the way she might have hoped. He didn't feel anger or longing, just closure. He sat quietly for a moment before picking up the phone and calling Millie. "Hey," he said when she answered. "Feel like grabbing dinner tonight?" Her voice was warm on the other end. "I'd love to." As months turned into a year, Nolan's life began to take shape in ways he never expected. He and Millie grew closer, their bond deepening with each passing day. They shared stories of their pasts, their hopes for the future, and the lessons they had learned from their pain. One evening, as they walked through a local park, Millie stopped and turned to him. "Nolan," she said, her voice soft. "Do you ever think about starting over? About building something new?" Nolan looked at her, his heart swelling with emotion. "I do. And for the first time, I'm not scared of it." She smiled, taking his hand. "Neither am I." Nolan's journey wasn't without its challenges. There were still moments of doubt, moments when he questioned whether he could truly move on. But with each passing day, those moments grew fewer and farther between. He had learned that betrayal didn't have to define him. It was a part of his story, yes, but it wasn't the whole story. He had the power to write the next chapter, to build a life filled with trust, love, and honesty. And as he stood in his workshop one evening, putting the finishing touches on a new project, a gift for Millie, he realized something important. For the first time in years, he wasn't looking back. He was looking forward, and the future looked bright. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Nolan's journey toward becoming a better version of himself was slow, deliberate, and often painful. At first, he struggled to find meaning in the wreckage left by Allison and Charles's betrayal. But with time, he began to see the events not as the end of his life, but as the beginning of something new. One of the first steps in his transformation came during a meeting at a local support group. Nolan had never been the type to share his personal struggles with strangers, but after his lawyer, Millie, gently encouraged him, he decided to give it a try. The room was modest, with a circle of chairs arranged around a small table. About a dozen people sat in the room, their faces a mixture of sadness, exhaustion, and cautious hope. "Welcome, everyone," the group leader said. "Tonight we're going to talk about letting go of the anger and finding strength in ourselves." "Nolan, would you like to share your story?" Nolan hesitated, his palms sweating. But then he stood, his voice steady but quiet. "My name is Nolan," he began. "And a little over a year ago, I found out that my wife of 20 years and my younger brother had been having an affair. Not just an affair, but a decades-long relationship that produced 3 children I thought were mine." The room was silent, all eyes on him. "For a long time, I let that betrayal define me," Nolan continued. "I felt like a failure as a husband, as a father, even as a man. But I realized something recently. Betrayal can break you, but it can also make you stronger. I'm living proof of that. The pain didn't destroy me. It transformed me." There was a murmur of encouragement from the group, and Nolan sat down, feeling lighter than he had in months. While Nolan was rebuilding himself, Allison and Charles were facing the harsh reality of prison life. Allison sat on the edge of her bunk in the cramped cell, staring at the gray concrete walls. She looked thinner, her face hollowed out by months of stress and regret. The world outside her cell seemed like a distant memory. "I wish we had never done this," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Charles, sitting on the opposite bunk, let out a bitter laugh. His once confident demeanor had been replaced by anger and bitterness. "We made our bed, Allison," he said, not even looking at her. "Now we have to lie in it. Stop whining about what's already done." Allison turned to face him, her eyes filled with tears. "Do you even regret it?" "Any of it?" Charles shrugged, his tone cold. "What's the point of regret? It doesn't change anything." Her voice broke. "It changed everything, Charles. We destroyed Nolan. We destroyed ourselves. And for what? A stupid affair?" Charles didn't respond. He leaned back against the wall, closing his eyes as if to shut out the sound of her voice. Back in the outside world, Nolan's transformation continued. He threw himself into activities that gave him a sense of fulfillment. He volunteered at local charities, spent time mentoring young professionals at work, and even began hosting woodworking workshops for teenagers. One afternoon, during a woodworking class at the community center, a teenage boy named Ethan approached him. "Hey, Mr. Parker," Ethan said, nervously shuffling his feet. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure," Nolan said, setting down the sandpaper he was using. "What's on your mind?" Ethan hesitated before speaking. How do you move on when someone hurts you really bad? Like, how do you not stay mad all the time?" Nolan paused, considering the question. "That's a tough one, Ethan," he said. "But here's what I've learned. Holding on to anger only gives the person who hurt you more power over your life. Moving on doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means choosing to focus on the things you can control. It means deciding that you're more than the pain they caused you." Ethan nodded slowly, as if the words were sinking in. "Thanks, Mr. Parker. I guess I needed to hear that." As Nolan became more confident and at peace with himself, his relationship with Millie grew stronger. They had started as friends, but over time, their connection deepened into something more. One evening, they sat together on Nolan's porch, watching the sun set over the horizon. "Do you ever think about them?" Millie asked gently. Nolan took a sip of his coffee, his gaze fixed on the orange and pink hues of the sky. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Not in the way I used to, though. I don't feel the anger anymore. Just pity." Millie looked at him surprised. "Pity?" He nodded. "They're stuck in a prison of their own making, even if they didn't get caught. People like that never find real happiness. They'll always be chasing something they can't have. Meanwhile, I get to move forward. I get to build something real." Millie reached over and took his hand. "You've come so far, Nolan, and you've done it with grace. I'm proud of you." He turned to her, a soft smile on his face. "I couldn't have done it without you, Millie. You've been my anchor through all of this." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the gentle chirping of crickets in the distance. In prison, Allison and Charles's relationship continued to deteriorate. Without the thrill of secrecy or the veneer of their lies, their bond crumbled under the weight of reality. One day, during a rare moment of conversation in the yard, Allison turned to Charles. "Do you think he'll ever forgive us?" she asked. Charles snorted. "Why would he? We ruined his life." Allison shook her head. "No, we ruined our lives. Nolan's probably doing better than ever now. He was always stronger than we gave him credit for." Charles didn't respond, but the bitterness in his eyes deepened. Nolan's journey culminated in a moment he hadn't anticipated. During a speech at a charity fundraiser, he spoke about the importance of resilience and transformation. "Life doesn't always go the way we planned," he said, his voice steady and clear. "Sometimes, the people we trust the most let us down in ways we can't imagine. But those moments don't define us. How we respond to them does." As the audience applauded, Nolan felt a sense of closure. He had come full circle, from betrayal and anger to strength and peace. Later that evening, as he and Millie danced under the soft glow of string lights, Nolan whispered in her ear, "I finally feel free." She smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "You deserve it, Nolan. You deserve all of it." And for the first time in years, Nolan believed it. The snowfall had stopped by the time Nolan stepped out of his truck, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp evening air. He clutched a small bouquet of wildflowers in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. In front of him stood Millie's house, its warm glow spilling out through the frosted windows, promising the kind of comfort Nolan had once believed was lost to him forever. As he approached the door, it swung open before he could knock. Millie stood there, her face lit with a welcoming smile that never failed to set his heart at ease. "You're early," she teased, brushing her hands on the apron tied around her waist. "I couldn't wait," Nolan replied with a grin. "Besides, I brought dessert. Figured it might go well with that stew you've been hyping up." Millie laughed, stepping aside to let him in. The aroma of simmering vegetables and herbs filled the air, wrapping Nolan in a sense of warmth he was still learning to embrace. "Underestimating my appetite again, I see," she said as she led him to the kitchen. He watched as she moved around the room with ease, her hands busy setting the table while she hummed a tune under her breath. Nolan couldn't help but reflect on how different his life had become. A year ago, His world had been in shambles, consumed by betrayal and anger. Now, in the glow of Millie's home, he felt something he hadn't in years: peace. Over dinner, their conversation turned reflective. Millie sipped her wine and leaned back in her chair, studying Nolan. "You've come so far," she said softly. "When we first met, I wasn't sure you'd ever trust anyone again. And honestly, I wouldn't have blamed you if you didn't." Nolan set his fork down, his eyes fixed on his plate as he gathered his thoughts. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "Some days it felt impossible. I kept replaying everything in my head, what Sarah said, what Charles did. I couldn't escape it. But you did," Millie said, her voice steady with conviction. He looked up, meeting her gaze. "You helped me," he said simply. "You listened when I needed to talk, even when I didn't make sense. You reminded me that I wasn't broken, just rebuilding. I owe a lot to you." Millie shook her head, a gentle smile playing on her lips. "You don't owe me anything, Nolan. You did the hard work. I was just here to cheer you on." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the kind that only exists between two people who truly understand each other. After dinner, they moved to the living room and settled by the fireplace, steaming mugs of hot cocoa in hand. Millie leaned her head on Nolan's shoulder, her fingers tracing idle patterns on his arm. "Do you ever think about them?" she asked, her voice quiet. He didn't need to ask who she meant. His jaw tightened at the mention of Sarah and Charles, but his gaze didn't waver from the flickering flames. "Sometimes," he admitted, "not because I want to, but out of curiosity. I wonder if they've changed or if they even regret what they did. But then I remind myself it doesn't matter. They're not my responsibility anymore." Millie nodded, her touch grounding him. "That's a healthy way to look at it. It took me years to stop letting my ex-husband's choices define me." Nolan turned to her, a flicker of curiosity in his eyes. "You've never talked much about him." "Why?" "Because he doesn't deserve to take up space in my life anymore," she said simply. "He was controlling, manipulative. Leaving him was the hardest thing I ever did, but it was also the best." "Do you ever regret it?" "Not for a second." Her voice was firm, unwavering. Then, after a pause, she added, "But you're different, Nolan. You feel different." Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, Nolan felt his heart swell in a way he hadn't thought possible. Weeks turned into months, and their bond only deepened. Millie's infectious energy brought out a side of Nolan he hadn't seen in years. They danced in the kitchen, took spontaneous road trips, and dreamed up plans for the future. One crisp evening, as they walked along the park trail near Millie's house, Nolan stopped abruptly. Millie turned, her brow furrowed in concern. "What is it?" she asked. Nolan hesitated, his hands stuffed deep into his jacket pockets. He had rehearsed this moment a dozen times in his mind, but now that it was here, words felt inadequate. "When Sarah and Charles betrayed me, I thought I'd never recover," he began, his voice steady. "I didn't think I'd ever trust anyone again, let alone love someone. But then you came into my life, and you changed everything. You reminded me that there's still good in the world. More than that, you made me believe in second chances." Millie's expression softened, her eyes shimmering with emotion. Before she could respond, Nolan pulled a small velvet box from his pocket. "I didn't plan this," he said with a nervous chuckle. "I don't even know if this is the right time or place. But I know one thing. I don't want to spend another day without you by my side. Millie, will you marry me?" Tears welled in her eyes as she looked at the ring, then back at him. Her answer came without hesitation. "Yes. 1,000 times yes." Nolan slipped the ring onto her finger, and they embraced, the world around them fading into irrelevance. News of Nolan's engagement eventually reached Sarah through mutual acquaintances. She sat in her prison cell, the letter clutched in her hands. Her heart sank as she read the words, each one cutting deeper than the last. "He's moved on," she muttered to herself. "He's happy." Across the cafeteria table, Charles looked up from his tray, unimpressed. "Good for him. Means he's not wasting time thinking about us." Sarah glared at him, her frustration bubbling over. "How can you be so indifferent? Don't you feel even the slightest bit of guilt?" Charles shrugged, unfazed. "What's the point? Guilt won't change anything. This is our life now. For Sarah, the weight of knowing Nolan had found happiness while she remained trapped in misery was too much to bear. Back in Nolan's world, preparations for the wedding were in full swing. It was a small, intimate affair with only close friends and family in attendance. On the day of the ceremony, as Millie walked down the aisle, Nolan felt his breath catch. She looked radiant, her smile lighting up the room. When she reached him, she leaned in and whispered, "You ready for this?" Nolan smiled back, his voice steady. "I've been ready my whole life." As they exchanged vows, Nolan felt a profound sense of closure. The pain and betrayal of the past were still there, but they no longer defined him. This was his second chance at love, at life, at happiness. Later that evening, as he stood under the stars, Nolan reflected on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about Sarah and Charles, about the man he'd once been and the man he'd become. "Thank you," he murmured to the night sky, "for showing me who I never want to be, and for helping me find who I'm meant to be." With that, he returned to the party, ready to embrace his future with open arms. Morning sunlight spilled into the modest, sunlit home Nolan and Millie had recently moved into. The dining table, simple yet sturdy, bore the weight of Nolan's journal, its worn pages a testament to years of self-reflection. Nolan sat quietly, pen poised over the blank page, his thoughts circling back to the journey he'd taken, a path marked by betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimately healing. The memory of those moments felt distant now, like a storm that had long since passed. He began to write slowly, the words deliberate. Betrayal has a way of breaking you, but it also has a way of building you back stronger. I didn't think I'd ever find peace after what Allison and Charles did, but here I am. The truth is, pain teaches you more about yourself than happiness ever could. As the ink dried, he set the pen down and glanced out the window. Millie was in the garden, crouched among the flower beds they had planted together. She wore her wide-brimmed sun hat, her hands covered in soil as she tenderly cared for the budding roses. Nolan watched her with a quiet smile, marveling at the peace he had found in the life they were building. The sunlight seemed to dance around her, illuminating the love and stability she had brought into his world. That afternoon, they headed to his parents' house for their usual Sunday tradition of a shared meal. The visit had become a ritual, one filled with warmth, laughter, and the comfort of family. Nolan's mother greeted them at the door with a broad smile and pulled them into a welcoming embrace. "You're just in time," she said cheerfully. "I made your favorite roast, Nolan. And Millie, I hope you brought your appetite." Millie laughed, her eyes sparkling. "Always," she replied, her voice light and warm. As they settled into their meal, the conversation flowed easily, stories and laughter weaving through the room. But midway through dinner, Nolan's mother grew quieter, an unusual hesitance in her expression. She glanced at her husband before turning to Nolan. "I got a letter from Allison last week," she said softly. The room fell still. Nolan paused, his fork halfway to his mouth, and stared at her. Millie, sensing the tension, reached under the table to give his hand a comforting squeeze. "She's still in prison, of course," his mother continued. "But she wrote to apologize. She said she regrets everything she did and asked if I'd pass the message on to you." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken emotions. Nolan set his fork down, his jaw tight. His father cleared his throat, his tone gruff but steady. "Let it go, son. She made her choices, and you've moved on. Don't let her drag you back into that mess." Millie leaned closer to Nolan, her touch a quiet reassurance. "It's your decision," she said gently. "Whatever you feel, I'll be here." Later that evening, back at home, Nolan sat on the couch with the letter in his hand. His mother had brought it out after dinner, uncertain whether he'd even want to see it. Millie sat beside him, quietly supportive as he unfolded the paper and began to read. The words on the page were filled with regret and anguish. Allison wrote of the pain her choices had caused and how she thought about it every day. She admitted that her betrayal had cost her everything, her freedom, her dignity, and most of all him. The letter ended abruptly, the final words smudged, as if she had hesitated or struggled to find the right thing to say. When he finished reading, Nolan folded the letter carefully and let out a long breath. Millie watched him closely, her voice soft when she finally spoke. "How do you feel?" He stared at the letter in his hands for a moment before answering. "I don't know. Part of me feels pity for her, but not forgiveness. I don't think I'll ever have that." "That's okay," Millie said, her voice steady. "Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or excusing what she did. It's just about letting go of the weight." A faint smile tugged at his lips as he turned to her. "You're right. I've already let go. This letter doesn't change anything." Months later, while sorting through old family documents, Nolan stumbled upon an unmarked envelope tucked away among his grandmother's belongings. Inside was a letter, yellowed with age and written in her elegant handwriting. As he read, the words struck him like a thunderclap. "If you're reading this, Nolan, it means you've discovered the truth I've carried with me for so long. Charles isn't your brother by blood. Your parents adopted him as a baby, but they chose to keep it a secret. I never had the heart to tell you before, but I hope this knowledge helps you understand that family isn't always about blood. It's about the bonds we choose to honor." The letter fell from his hands, and he sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. Charles wasn't his brother. The betrayal that had shattered his life hadn't come from a sibling, but from someone who was, in the end, a stranger. When he shared the revelation with Millie, her eyes widened in shock. "Does it change how you feel about everything?" she asked. Nolan shook his head slowly. "Not really. Betrayal is betrayal, no matter where it comes from. But it's freeing in a way. I don't have to carry the weight of thinking my own brother did this to me." Millie smiled, resting her hand on his arm. "That's a powerful truth to uncover. Maybe it's a reminder that your real family is the one you've built for yourself." Years passed, and Nolan found himself using his experiences to help others. He became a speaker at local support groups, sharing his story of heartbreak, resilience, and hope. One evening, after one of his talks, a young man approached him, his expression earnest. "Your story really resonated with me," the man said. "I've been struggling to move on after my own divorce, and hearing you talk about rebuilding gave me hope." "Thank you." Nolan placed a reassuring hand on the man's shoulder and smiled warmly. "The hardest part is believing you can start over. But once you do, you'll realize just how strong you really are." That night, Nolan and Millie sat on their porch, watching the sun sink below the horizon. The sky was a canvas of warm colors, and the air was filled with the quiet hum of crickets. Millie turned to him, her face serene. "Do you ever think about how far you've come?" she asked. Nolan nodded, his gaze steady. "Every day. I used to think my story ended with betrayal, but now I see it was just the beginning." Millie raised her glass of wine, her smile radiant. "To new beginnings and unexpected truths." Nolan clinked his glass against hers, his heart full. "To love and life," he said. And as the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Nolan felt a deep sense of peace. His scars remained, but they no longer defined him. They were simply part of the journey, a testament to the strength he had found and the life he had built.